we haven't really, I think, written an update since the last time. In 2017, the college was dealing with a deficit of 4.8 million, right? And that was when you came on as president. Can you tell me like what happened or what was the situation the college was in then?
Sure, they did. They have a serious deficit. They had a couple of years that sort of ballooned into a large deficit. And so that became, the deficit sort of emerged between the time I was hired and when I started. So I walked into a situation where that, of course, was the number one priority to maintain the fiscal health. And it took us a couple years to get the ship completely righted, but we've had multi-million-dollar surpluses for the last 2 years. And we got there by pretty simple ways. We improved our whole structure for managing budgets. We cut expenses. But we did that pretty systematically. So some of the things that other institutions did, we did eliminate some programs, but we did that in a multi-year process. So we didn't have any dismissal of faculty members. It was done through attrition and reassignment. But we got a better match between the overall size of staff and faculty and the size of the institution that we were. And made some other cuts that were a little tough, and we're starting to work back funding for some of those things.
There's also kind of a rebranding, right? Is that when the new name?
Well, yes, absolutely. At the same time, we were talking about a strategic plan, which is how do we grow our enrollment? How do we improve our name recognition in the area? Sage, part of its strength is it had been so many different things. We'd responded. It was originally, of course, a women's college. That's key to its identity and its origin. That was the Russell Sage College campus in Troy. But the junior college in Albany had been there for 40 years and had become a 4-year co-ed institution. We'd increasingly had graduate programs. We'd always had professional programs. Now about half our students are graduate students. So if you talk to different people in the region, you got a half dozen different views of what is the Sage Colleges. So we did rebrand it, going back to our original name, uniting our Albany and Troy campuses so they're all part of the same college with the same curriculum. The students can move back and forth freely. It's entirely co-ed, but still dedicated to that social equity mission upon which it was founded. And so that's what we were working with, really to build on once we got a healthy baseline and we weren't bleeding money and we had a good, efficient operation. We could start working on growing our enrollment, on new programs. We started just this year a doctorate in occupational therapy. And it's been a really steady progress, but it's important to recognize those troubles a few years ago. We've clearly moved beyond that to a level of fiscal stability. And man, am I thankful for that, because the pandemic came along. And had we been in a situation where we were running a deficit and had to deal with all the pressures of the pandemic, I think it would have been extremely challenging. I mean, it's challenging enough, let's be honest, for all of us in higher ed in this environment. But because we were starting from a baseline where we had fit our staff and faculty size to who we were, and we weren't bleeding money, we were healthy. We've been able to manage, since the pandemic really began in March, with moving students to remote in the spring, bringing them back in person in the fall. We have had no layoffs or furloughs at Sage. Every single one of our employees who wants to stay here has been able to stay and work, some remotely, some on campus and so forth. So I think that's been a real success story for us.
And I mean, that's really exceptional. I don't know of another institution in the region that hasn't had to lay people off or furlough people, at least during that break when campuses were closed. I assume like the sort of maintenance, the people who do the day-to-day operations on campus were temporarily furloughed, right? Or
no, they were not furloughed. Now, there was a period in which they did not work,
right?
But they had full pay and benefits. They were not put on furlough. And they did not work because they were not able to do their jobs remotely. Obviously, if you're a painter, an electrician, during that period when we had to operate remotely as not being an essential business, we kept everyone on payroll for that. We knew it was temporary. And yes, you could take the strategy, you're going to let people go and bring them back when you can. But we had also, we had made the cuts earlier to reduce our workforce size, which meant we were working with a lean workforce. I think some other colleges, it's natural when times are good, you grow your staff a lot. And then sometimes when revenue is challenged, you have to cut back, and there's that back and forth. But we've asked a lot out of our employees to work with the smaller staff. So we wanted to be loyal to them during this difficult time.
But then the room and board costs that were reimbursed, a lot of campuses are saying they spent millions of dollars, and CARES Act funds didn't even cover a fraction of that. What was the blow to Sage?
Well, we refunded half of the room and board to students for spring semester. And so that was a significant hit, and it was greater than the CARES Act funding. We had other expense savings that we pulled together. Some of it was natural, there was no travel. So
Right.
we were spending travel money. We had some breaks with, our food service provider. Our contract didn't charge us the full amount when we didn't have the students on campus being served. And so we were able to manage, and we ended the year with a surplus of almost $3 million there.
Wow.
We were really just shooting to break even, and some things worked well for us. I will say, to be fair, about half our students are graduate students, so they are primarily not students who live on campus. And we were able to keep up the classes remotely, of course, like all colleges did.
Right.
So we weren't, some colleges are a little more heavily invested in all of their students being residential than we are. I think we were helped too because we draw a lot from New York State and the region. And that has made it easier, even when you deal like with fall, bringing students back to campus. We didn't have a lot of students who had to quarantine for out of state and so forth.
I am curious about shifting remote, because I know you have a lot of medical professions. You train people for medical professions, and a lot of it is, occupational therapy. It requires a lot of hands-on training. How did you adjust to that?
Well, we had to be very creative. And I think one of the themes here is that as a small institution, we've been able to change quickly and be creative with modest resources. We did that in a variety of ways. We kept up the clinicals as much as we could, but when hospitals and other medical sites became overloaded, of course, the clinical experiences were shut down. We created simulation experiments, both online, primarily online. In some cases, with our graduate programs, some of the experiences had to be postponed and got picked up in the summer. And all those students have been caught up with their experiences. We worked with all the professional associations because they were dealing with this across the country for ways to make exceptions, alternative ways to fulfill clinicals. On some of the graduate programs, we shifted the order of classes for what people were taking to allow people to get the clinicals. And then this fall, people have been able to have their clinical experiences.
Am I remembering this correctly? Some of your students, a lot of them are nurses, and they were actually on the front lines at first, helping out with the effort in sort of hotspots. Can you talk about that?
Absolutely. Well, that's been true. And I think, there are a variety of benefits that we've had experienced because such a large portion of our students are involved in the health professions, and particularly nursing at the undergraduate and graduate level. So most of our master's students are employed nurses,
Right.
and they're getting their master's degrees. So they were working at all kinds of, hospitals, emergency rooms, and clinics, and so forth, as well as pursuing their classes. We also had the experience, there are really some dramatic and moving stories too from our educational leadership program, which is students in the capital region and in New York City who are fairly high-level educational administrators getting their doctorate in educational leadership. So we had people who were New York City principals working out the pandemic while they were finishing their thesis here, and really dedicated people. They wouldn't be where they were if they weren't. We also have been, using our nursing faculty to assist with the testing we conduct on campus. We're currently working with Albany Med for some of our nursing students to assist with vaccinations. We worked with the National Guard. We turned over our armory. It's an old armory that we use for athletic practices and gatherings on our Albany campus. And the National Guard used that in spring and summer for the assembling of testing kits.
So can you tell me about your general COVID response? I know every campus was a little different and had a slightly different strategy. I heard about you were partnering with the Albany College of Pharmacy for some of that testing.
Yeah, and I think this is an important story. There's one sense in which all the colleges had to have a set of things. Everybody had to do the same kind of things when it came to social distancing, to masking, to hygiene and sanitation. There's sort of a core set of CDC principles for limiting the spread of the virus that everyone had to abide by. And then I think each institution had to look at, what are our institutional strengths and how do we build on that to have as successful semester as we can under these circumstances. And for us, one of them you've already touched on, which is we have a lot of students who are in the health sciences. And that means, for example, that things like how to wash your hands is actually part of their curriculum. They learn it and get tested on it, but they also do it every day in the clinical sites, and they're used to wearing masks. And I think they served as examples for other students because they were used to it, they were familiar with it. It was part of, blocking the spread of disease in their everyday life. But the other thing that we're known for is we're an institution with a lot of professional and graduate programs, but we are small. And we emphasize being a small institution that has real personal connection with students. You're known by your name, you're not a number. And there were ways we were able to leverage that. So for example, every residential student, we moved to a single room arrangement. So no one had a roommate. And that was important partly for contagion, but the real advantage that gave us was for quarantine. Students could quarantine in their own rooms. They didn't have to be moved. They didn't have to be moved to a separate facility. We would deliver meals to their rooms. We had our own contact tracers that we trained, and that meant when we had a positive case, and we ultimately didn't have very many. It was in the 30s over the fall semester, starting from August 1st. But when we had a case, we could immediately interview the person, do the contact tracing, and put into quarantine anyone in the Sage community that they've been in contact with. We, of course, worked with the county departments of health, but if we were relying on them, it would have been a couple days before they were reaching out to people just by the necessity of the amount of people that they deal with. So there are a lot of ways in which I think our size helped us manage and avoid significant outbreaks. Our faculty, because we are not primarily a research institution, our faculty do research, but we're a teaching institution, that's their top priority. So when it came to developing different modalities of teaching and being able to deal with maybe there are 5 people in the classroom in quarantine and some others who want to be on campus, you have to use a high flex model of teaching. They were very dedicated to that and willing to put in the extra time. And they were also used to checking on the well-being of students because this is a difficult time. A lot of students were very isolated. And part of that classroom connection was taking place in our remote semester via Zoom was also making sure people were okay, that they had a good situation at home, that they weren't overly depressed or anxious. So that was a positive that we had. And I mentioned already that small size has tended to make us very flexible and creative. And there were a lot of ways that played out.
What was the on-campus population this semester? And how does that compare?
The on-campus population. So for us, we have about 2,300 students, and about half of them are graduate and half undergraduate. And then the undergraduate population is about half commuter, half on campus. So we have about 500 to 600 students who are residential. And then the rest of the undergraduates are commuter campuses from the commuter students from the region.
I just think it's interesting because, this was sort of a big experiment. Like we learned so much from, each camp was sort of like a study in what works for disease control. So I'm just like curious, was there any scares? Like, was there an outbreak or did you have to quarantine anyone over the course of the semester?
We had nothing that I would call an outbreak, but we certainly did quarantine. So as I said, I think over the course, we had 2,300 students, and I think August 1st through the end of classes, we had 37 positives that came up. And so with each of those people, we would do the interviews. In some cases, it might involve 2 or 3 people going in quarantine. In some places, it might be 12 as a result of their contacts, because it included, the definition of close contact would include somebody you were within 6 feet of for 10 minutes or more, even if you're masked.
Right.
And so even people being pretty darn observant could have some contacts. And so we were very rigorous about it. But the other side that I think is important is that the students were pretty good about it. You know, when you
Mhm.
do contact tracing, it depends on people telling you the truth
Mhm.
about where they've been.
Right.
And we had all our students sign a Sage Strong pledge. But those things are only as good as people actually living up to them. And
How did you manage without test? Like, do a lot of your students get tested anyway because of their workplaces? Like they work in a medical setting?
well, we did, well, first of all, everyone was required to be tested before arriving on campus.
Got it.
So they had to show a negative test. We did develop the ability to test students who were symptomatic, and we've now developed the ability to do surveillance testing. As you mentioned, we cooperated initially with Albany College of Pharmacy. They're neighbors to our Albany campus, and they were looking at their strengths, which includes pharmacy students and faculty, and developed testing on their campus and collaborated with Albany Law, with Russell Sage, and with Maria College. And then eventually we developed our own capacity too. So testing was very much a moving target in terms
Yeah.
of what was accessible to people and what you could get. So we were not one of the colleges that was able to do the testing every 2 weeks and so forth, but we had that ability to do the testing and to track it. Now, as we go into spring semester, which is going to have probably some additional challenges because the infection rate is up, we do have plans for surveillance testing. We've been able to acquire the tests, some assistance from the state for that in order to be able to do rapid testing and target that at certain populations. We had a few more of our cases, even though there were only 30 something, a fair number were in a particular residence hall,
Yeah.
not all at once. So it wasn't like an outbreak of one to another. But we're going to be able to do some testing that focuses on those groups that might be more at risk.
There's a lot of hand wringing about like small private colleges about whether they're sustainable because there's just so much demographic changes in the region. Was I unfair to categorize Sage as in that same category? It's the college's past financial struggles as the same category, or do you feel like because it's mainly graduate students and specific fields, you see it sustained in the long term?
Well, I think Russell Sage is very sustainable, but it would be naive not to say that this is a tough time for higher education in general.
Yeah.
And small private colleges, the public colleges are a different story. They have a lot of difficulty too, and they're competing for state funds with the increased cost of healthcare and so forth. All of us in higher ed need to be rethinking our model. And I think Sage has some advantages there. I wish we had the advantage of a huge endowment and things like that, which really helps. But
Yeah.
because we haven't had that, we've had to think about how to offer a good quality education without spending a ton of money. And I think that's the future, because historically, the reason it's not just the demographics, it's the fact that the cost of college has increased faster than inflation for 40 years. And eventually you got to stop doing that or you price yourself out of the market. And so we've been able to be a low cost private college that gives students and families that private college experience without having to go into enormous debt. And so as people are really rethinking student debt, the cost of college, the value of the experience, I think we're in a good place for the future. But this is a tough time for colleges. You're absolutely right.
Aren't there certain programs that are pretty much only offered here or 2 places in the state? So pretty much, I don't know, I was talking to some of your students that were telling me how, you offer some like rare certifications that are only available here.
We have some really distinctive programs. Our interior design program is the only one in the region. And that's a plus for us. Some of the programs, we have a long history in areas like physical therapy and in nursing. We're about to have the 100th anniversary of our nursing program. We're not a college that just started it up recently. We have a long history of that. Physical therapy has been around more than 50 years. In that sense, we have some specific degrees like forensic psychology and so forth that are distinctive. We offer an online program, applied behavioral analysis, which isn't offered a whole lot of places. That's primarily with administrators and other people who work with autistic students and people with different learning styles. And of course, we have a lot of the mainstream majors, whether it's criminal justice or business or sociology or history. That's an important part of who we are too.
So can you talk, has the pandemic had any other effects on sort of your nursing program? Are you seeing like an increased interest in the nursing profession? Are your students in higher demand? How's it changed?
I think it's too early to tell in terms of how are young people thinking about careers. There's really two sides to it. I mean, it's reminded people that there are certain risks you take on when you're a frontline health worker, but there's also been a lot of attention to how important those people are, even at times heroic. And it's certainly clear that that's an area where our need for people is not going to disappear. So in that sense, it probably is good for increasing interest in the field, but there's a lot of interest in the field already. I think for our own students in nursing, and really for all our students, whether it's a student who's a straight health science major or public health major, or somebody who's in nursing or physical therapy, there's a lot about the pandemic that I think is clarifying. I mean, one of the things that I've stressed is we're an educational institution, and there are many things that this is, including a disaster, but it's a learning moment. It's a teaching moment. And the fact that individual actions have public consequences and that you have a responsibility, not just to yourself, but to the larger society, it's easy to talk about that in the abstract, but it is really apparent to people as they think about wearing a mask, limiting the size of social gatherings. And then the people who really realize it, when I hear, on TV, these people say, oh, it's just like the flu or it's a hoax. All you got to do is talk to people who are working in an emergency room or an ICU and know that's not true. People say, this is an experience. I've worked 25 years in a clinical environment, and I've never had to deal, with this much mortality. And so I think it has sharpened the seriousness of what's already, I think, a pretty serious generation. I mean, this is the generation that was born during the last recession and is going to college during the pandemic and the recession that's associated with it. So I think they're very serious about their careers, and Sage students have always been that way. One of the things that I'd like to point out, I think one of the things that worked well for us this year is that our students did come back. Our retention actually went up from where it was the previous year. And there was a lot of concern that people would stop out for a year. They might be afraid to come back or think it's just not the experience they wanted. We didn't know either. Yeah. So we were very glad to see them back. But part of it is that Sage students aren't necessarily, I'm going to take a year off from college type. We have a lot of first generation students. We were just recognized by US News and World Report over the last 2 years as a top college in social mobility. And that's based on the success of graduating low-income students. So these are students, by and large, who do not take being in college for granted. Yeah. And they would much rather have had a regular commencement or the ability to have big parties, but they weren't going to put their education on hold.
Right. That's amazing. That's so interesting. All right. Well, is there now looking forward, I guess, any expenses you anticipate? It's going to be such a different situation in next month when students return. You said you
expenses. Yeah. Well, there are a couple things. Well, as I said, we're expanding our surveillance testing. We have a plan. It's going to depend on the public health situation to resume athletic competition in March. That involves testing athletes 3 times a week when they begin practicing and through the whole period. So we're prepared for that. As you know, the CARES Act has provided another round of funding. And so that is very helpful for being able to sustain testing, and half of that funding at least will go directly to students as well. So that is a plus. It's something that they really need. In terms of the vaccine, we have done the initial paperwork to be a vaccination site. It's, I think, up in the air about how the state's going to manage this really complicated logistic situation, but they were asking colleges if they were willing to do that. And they did ask you if you were willing to be a site to vaccinate your own community, if you're willing to be a site to vaccinate a larger community. We've indicated our interest in doing a larger community.
Are
We
you
have,
concerned about, can I jump in? Are you worried
yeah,
about the
yeah.
new regulations? Does that make it dissuade, you think, educational institutions from participating?
You mean the $100,000 fine?
Yeah.
That gave me pause the other day. I'm going to want to see what the situation is and what the staffing would be from the state and the expectations. I mean, I think the governor put that out in response to, the initial run of working with hospitals.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot that still has to be worked out. And whether or not turning to colleges as vaccination sites will be part of that, I don't know. I think it's probably a good idea. We have health centers. We've been conducting testing. But we don't want to be in a situation where we face a $100,000 fine and we don't know how many vaccines are coming in each week. But I think, there's an understanding of that when we work with the governor's office. If we can be of help, well, we want to do that. And if they go,
You have those refrigerators, the super cold freezers?
We do not have those. Now there, of course, the Moderna just requires regular, and the AstraZeneca is also easier to deal with. I think there are ways to use dry ice with the
Right.
Pfizer vaccine, but we don't have super fancy. And I think actually most colleges would not have that
Right.
unless they have really
That makes
advanced
sense.
laboratories.
Right. All right. And I guess, the restrictions are probably going to be a little bit more tighter given the situation in the capital region. Sort of we're seeing record cases. Are you prepared for that? Like, how are you preparing for, a whole different?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things we learned very quickly, if you go back to last March when the regulations changed like 3 times in 1 week,
Yeah.
is you've got to be flexible. You've got to plan for different scenarios. We have done that. Obviously, like a lot of colleges last spring, we were able to switch to remote. If we have to do that, if that's what the public health situation demands, we're prepared to do that. And we're prepared to do even a better job with it this time around. I think there's a lot of interest in trying to avoid that.
Yeah.
From what I sense from the state, and trying to keep businesses operating. So we want to build on the successes we had with fall. Obviously, if there's more infection in the surrounding society, we're going to experience more.
Right.
We don't have an impenetrable barrier,
Yeah.
and our students come and go. And I will say that, New York State had these standards where colleges would have to shift to remote if they hit 100 cases,
Right.
or was it 5% of their student
Right.
body? And we didn't come anywhere near that.
Yeah.
So we don't want to see more cases, but we think we have the capacity for that.
Yeah.
We are going to be probably adding a position to work in the health center to be able to handle a lot of testing. And I think, one of the things I've seen that's impressed me about our faculty and our staff was how adaptable they were.
Yeah.
I think they all realized if we're going to make it, this is an extraordinary situation. This isn't something where, the big bad administration is just asking us to do stuff for no reason. This is about making sure our students can continue their education and that we as an institution can be healthy and contribute to the public health of the society. And so they were very flexible, and we have de-densified our offices. So what we try to do, we talked a little bit earlier about, what constitutes a close contact. We try to set it up so our regular operation doesn't have any close contacts. So
Right.
our classrooms had the 6-foot distancing, but also had students wearing masks. And that's true in our everyday operations. So that helps a lot. But, I'm concerned, as everyone is, about what's happening now.
Yeah.
The Capital District really in the country as a whole. And
Yeah.
so we need to be prepared to respond to that, and we are.
Are you considering maybe delaying students return to campus, or I know some people.
We redid our schedule to open a week later than normal and got rid of spring break because that's so unmanageable if you're trying to control
Yeah.
student travel. So we're set to open the 25th of January. And right now that's our plan. But, one of the things that I would also say helped contribute to our success is that, New York State was a state that was really depending on science. It was making decisions. It was making changes when things changed. But we sometimes forget, even though we may chafe against the regulations here in the state, there are some states that didn't have that kind of guidance at all. and institutions were really on their own. And so one of the things we know is we can talk a lot about this is what we're going to do, but the state's going to step in with at the very least strong guidelines. And so if the state is suggesting a later opening makes sense, we will certainly cooperate with that. Right now, our plan is to open on the 25th for first day of classes. But we're gonna have to see what happens in the next few weeks.
Okay. All right. Anything else, like any advice to other college presidents who are, dealing with the same challenges that, everyone's dealing with, from COVID to enrollment decline?
Well, one thing that has been, I guess, a plus or certainly a characteristic of the pandemic is that everyone's experiencing it. So, I've had a lot of conversations with other college presidents. We've used our collaborative groups to share ideas and best practices. And that's also important because we are a small college. It's important for everyone else, but to be able to leverage, everyone's knowledge at the table. So that's been true with the Capital District Higher Education Consortium, which is both publics and privates working together. We've had meetings with that. Our CICU, which represents the private colleges in the state, has been a tremendous resource for us. And so I've really benefited from being able to have other people's counsel and so forth. If there was one bit of advice I would give that I think we've learned from this is to keep your institutional strengths in mind in crafting the policy that works for you, the things that have made you successful as an institution. RPI is a technical university. They worked with epidemiology in creating testing and really emphasized that. We emphasize our folks who work in the health sciences and health professions, and also the small size and the advantage that gave us in a whole variety of ways in terms of flexibility and de-densifying. And I think for other colleges, you think about what are the things that really work for us.
It's not a one-size-fits-all solution.
It's not. They're the core things that everyone has to do in common. We all take seriously the CDC standards and New York State Department of Health standards. But then how you get your students to comply and still have a good experience, that varies institution by institution. How your faculty respond and the different things that they're willing and able to do in the classroom, that varies, I think, some from institution to institution. Yeah, so absolutely not one size fits all.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks so much for taking the time to speak with me.
Thank you, Rachel. It's nice to have a little time to talk with you. I appreciate it.